All right, welcome to the CatholicPsych Show. Today we will be talking about the new trend of being boy sober for the summer. This is the dating world. We'll also be talking about the adoption paradox, and we'll probably start, we can't avoid it, we're going to start a little bit with the NATO summit and our President Joe Biden. Dr. Greg, welcome back from the metaverse. I'm glad someone dragged you out and pulled you out. I know you were lost there on Wednesday. How are you doing on this Friday?
The metaverse. Was I in a virtual world?
If you don't know, that's even more concerning.
I'm great. Friday. It's Friday. Thank God it's Friday.
Yes. I want to remind people too, if you don't know, we're going to do a Monday mailbag. So get your questions in.
Is it Monday mailbag now?
Monday mailbag. We're going to do mailbag. Send your email questions to mailbag@catholicpsych.com. Put mailbag in the subject line so we can engage with you and talk about what you want us to talk about. Within reason, of course.
Especially if you don't want us to talk about Biden anymore, because every day, every show, I'm like, all right, let's give this a rest. And then every day there's a new headline.
Single.
It's so ridiculous.
Every single day. So we might as well just try and get out of the way as best we can. The thing is, like, that's all people want to talk about. Like, it's like what gets the views. People want to talk about politics, but we don't really want to talk about politics as much as we do, but we have to at least address some of these issues, right?
I mean, I think there's some legitimacy to the fact that who our president is and what the world thinks about our president and what the president is doing to our country is like a fairly significant dimension of our life. You know, it's like very different from like the Pope, yes. Which is, we've talked about this, but it's like Pope Francis. Okay, headline today, Pope Francis on the ethics of AI. But like, I could go for the next year without anything Pope Francis says or does actually affecting my life.
Yeah.
Can I go for the next year without something that the president is doing or not doing affecting my life, my day-to-day life? Like, no.
You cannot.
This is impactful.
You're impacted by this elderly man. Okay, so the 75th anniversary summit of NATO came to a close yesterday with leaders of 32 countries bolstering support for Ukraine.
Wait. First of all, did you just say that in like a sarcastic way? Like, should I not be affected by this elderly man?
I'm saying you are affected by the elderly man. The joke is
you're pointing it out as if it might be something that I'm asking. Are you saying that in a way that I should not be affected by that, or are you?
I wasn't
adding to the joke, like how adding to the absurdity because he's an elderly man. It's like ridiculous that he does have this impact on us.
I don't think I thought it through to that extent. I was commenting on the fact that he's elderly. Now that you're raising the question, to what extent should we be affected by the daily news? I mean, I've gone through periods. I mean, we are on a live news show, but I've gone through periods of my life where I'm like, I'm done. I'm just like detoxing from the news for a while, and life just kind of went on. Like maybe I noticed gas prices rising, but like
that's my point though. Like gas prices rising, like educational standards dropping, like whether or not there are federal vouchers for education. Like my friends just moved to Florida.
Yes.
They get $8,000 per kid and a voucher because of policies set by the government. They have 9 kids.
A lot of money.
Do you understand? Like that is a significant impact on your life. Like these are important things that the government and I'm not saying it matters because the daily news is telling us things that are happening in the headlines. I'm saying there's more of an impact and an actual real life effect on my life coming from politics than there is coming from like different news cycles where like, oh, the media wants to spin something about Pope Francis or whatever. It's like, okay, sure. I don't need to get sucked into that vortex.
Sure. There's a difference, though. I think to your point, there's a difference between local government affecting your day-to-day, whether it's even your town government, and like what our beloved president said at the NATO conference. It's like,
yeah, we have like a house issue with like a permitting thing, and we have to like Barbara's on the phone for like an hour with like town hall, and she's got to figure out like what the policy is about a septic tank being like, in records going back 10 years, 15. It's like the stuff matters.
Those are technically politics. But I don't know that everyone. I think most people spend their time thinking about like national politics more so than they do their local politics. But
All
their
right, so
local politics
finish the
impact them.
headline for today because this is a good point in the
Okay.
conversation.
So the 75th anniversary summit of NATO came to a close yesterday with the leaders of 32 countries bolstering support for Ukraine in its ongoing war with Russia. Now, certainly the war with Ukraine and Russia does affect us, right? I mean, even just economically, it does affect us. But I mean, it's probably a couple steps removed before it affects us like day to day, right? But this is important. The conference hosted by President Joe Biden in Washington, D.C. ended with new pledges to Kiev, including air defense missile systems and fresh aid commitments, France, Germany. And then, by the way, I'm not minimizing like how terrible it is for the people in Kiev and in Ukraine and in Russia and the atrocities of war that they have to go through, by the way.
Right.
France, Germany, Italy, and Poland agreed to develop and host long-range missiles on their soil as a deterrence measure. Germany will also host U.S. missiles. Leaders, meanwhile, issued a rare statement condemning China for supplying Russia with military uses. But nobody really cares about any of this because the news story that came out of the event were some of what we would call deviant verbalizations by President Joe Biden. Deviant verbalization.
Give him a Rorschach. Give him a Rorschach. See what happens.
So President Biden, in introducing the president of Ukraine, introduced him as President Putin, which is a pretty awkward moment. And then later, when asked a question about should Kamala Harris, like what would be her capability as president, should she have to run against President Trump in the upcoming November election, which is a funny question because it just implies that there's tremendous amount of turmoil going on about whether or not he should run. Like that was kind of like skipped over, right? George Clooney recently said that he should step down. That was like a news story in and of itself. It's an ongoing thing about the like division within the Democratic Party in terms of whether or not Biden should run because there's nobody thinks he's going to beat Trump. Can't imagine why, because he then referred to Kamala Harris as Vice President Trump. And he said that. So these are the two lines that came out of NATO where President Biden was called Zelensky President Putin and called Kamala Harris Vice President Trump. And one of my the funniest things for me so far is when they panned to his team and they were all just sitting there. You could see them like observing this, and the Democrats are in a tough spot because they're being accused of hiding his issues, his elderly issues.
Yeah.
And but they have to put him out there, and the more they put him out there, the more he's making himself vulnerable to criticism in terms of his capacity to make decisions as a president of the United States. So, what is your big picture takeaway from this? The fact that this is the news story when we have an important issue with Ukraine and Russia, and the thing that we're talking about was President Biden making these verbal mistakes.
Well, I think that he is clearly unfit, and that's really dangerous. Like, I do think, people have commented on this, like, what kind of position are we in right now as a country? Yeah. And this is really dangerous. So, I mean, I don't know what other kinds of checks and balances are really keeping Kim Jong-un or Putin in check right now. Yeah. But or any terrorist organization or everything else that's been happening. But it's bad optics. Like, it does not look good.
It doesn't look good. I've heard that people within the White House, within his administration, are actually kind of terrified of him. Like in the sense that we're all kind of scared of our boss in one way or another. But the reason why he's so insulated and people aren't challenging him and why he continues to double down on his running for president is that it's very difficult to like communicate with him and challenge him. And so there's this idea that like, well, he's just a puppet and someone else is actually running the show behind the scenes, or he actually is the one running the show. And there's not somebody that has power over him to make these kind of major decisions. And in some ways, that's more terrifying.
It's actually, it seems to be the case that it's more the latter. It also makes a lot more sense why he has the sense that he's doing a good job, because he's owning the authority.
Right.
And like, if he was a puppet, he wouldn't be sort of spontaneously coming up with all of these like reactions to these things that are, challenging his authority. He's like very clearly stepping into this role. And
Yeah.
did you watch I didn't watch the whole hour, but when he made the VP Trump comment was during a press conference yesterday. It was an hour-long press conference.
Right.
And if you watch like different sort of moments of it, watching this as a psychologist is like super interesting. And obviously we're not sitting here armchair diagnosing anybody, but he has so many different switches. Like, you're watching
Parts.
him and he's like,
Yeah.
he's got this whisper, and then he yells, and then he's got like the trail off part, and he's kind of like, and then he'll say like, and he has some clarity, he has some awareness that he's rambling, so then he'll say, but well, so anyway. And he does this
Yes.
anyway thing. And when he says anyway, I've heard comments on this, like it's kind of like a death blow.
Yeah.
Because every time he says anyway, it's like you've lost all credibility.
Yeah.
Or he also says like, I shouldn't say any more about this.
Yeah.
Like,
he also has the laughing at the criticism, the kind of look away laugh, as if it's like he's above the criticism. Like, it's crazy.
Like, oh, you confused Zelensky for Putin.
Right.
Like, oh, where are you going with this ridiculous comment?
Yeah. Someone asked him about how, like, the ways in which he's misspeaking, and like the risk of his opponent, President Trump, using that as fuel to gain further ground in the polls and everything. And he did that. He kind of laughed and smiled and looked away. He said, like, what would you say to those people who are listening to Trump right now? And he goes, listen to him. And that's like all he said. So I think he meant it as like, if you listen to Trump, it'll be very clear that I'm the candidate that you should vote for. But like, people took it at face value. It's like, listen to him, don't listen to me. It's like he doesn't have the full kind of context and the nuance necessary to like make the joke and really express what he means to express.
Yeah, it's pretty appalling. It's really not any kind of situation where it's like, oh, this is really interesting. Like, what's going to happen between these two, political, presidential. Neither are like, it's not like two presidential opponents where you'd be like, these two men who are so presidential, and we're just like,
and there's mutual respect. Like, I saw a comparison with I think it was like Romney versus Obama, and like their debate, and like they started off like kind of jabbing each other respectfully, but like honoring one another at the start of the debate. Like, that is not this.
Did you watch Trump's rally a couple of days ago, where he challenged Biden to a golf match?
No.
It was so good. He did this like quick rally. It was like 10-minute speech in Florida, and he challenged Biden to 18 holes. And he said he would give him 10 strokes on each side. And he said if Trump loses, he would donate $1 million to Biden's charity of choice.
Oh, wow. I don't think Biden wants to go out and play around a golf with Trump.
18 holes. I don't know what course it was in Florida, but
probably Trump's course.
Probably. It was like, well, he said it was one of the most challenging courses in the world, and whatever. He's like, we'll televise it. It'll be a bigger event than the Masters. I was like, you should have said he donated $1 million to his campaign. That would have made some headlines.
Yeah. So obviously we experience this inner tension, right? This inner tension when we learn about these news stories and the focus on the health of our current president, what that might mean. Is he going to step down? Is he going to be replaced? You have your growing theories about that he's going to be replaced by the Democratic Party. But how do you navigate any distress you feel about all this? Like, what's the what's the way in which we can not live in anxiety and distress over the contention of this political journey that we're on together?
Well, it's the only answer that ever is the answer, and it's like so simple. It's so true. How am I trying to say this? It's so true. It has to be a simple answer if it could be applied to literally any situation. It's not like, oh, this is a new problem, so we have to come up with some complex way of understanding the new answer to this really hard new problem we never anticipated. It's like, no, the only answer is the answer that can always be the answer for any problem that ever comes up.
Which is?
Trust.
In?
We have to trust that God is in control.
Our political system? Oh, okay. I mean, yes, it is simple. It is simple, and I think we need to kind of like creatively come up with ways to think about how we can feel consoled when experiencing.
We could do thought experiments. Like, you can remember, like, imagine in the end when it's like, when we see this whole thing unfolded, there will be a very clear answer that God can say, this is what I was doing that whole time.
Right.
And now you're on the other side of it and you can see it. You know, it's like Mother Teresa used to have that image of the tapestry that's being knit, and we see it from the underside, and we see the threads and the messiness of what's underneath it. But then from God's perspective, he's seeing it from the top, where it's beautiful. It's the most beautiful tapestry of a picture that's ever been created. And when we get to the position of God and we're in his perspective, we'll see the beautiful picture, even though right now we only see the backside. That doesn't make any sense.
Do you want to take a stab at it? At what's on the other side of the tapestry?
I have no idea.
What is God doing with the United States?
I mean, look, at the end of the day, every moment, it doesn't matter. Like, what is God doing with the crucifixion? Like, what was that? Like, that looked messy. That looked terrible. And then it's like, oh, he conquered it. He conquered death. He had to conquer death. So death had to happen so that he could conquer it. And it's like, look, even death doesn't have the final say. Like, what more do we need? What else? What other messiness could be on the other side of a tapestry that's worse than death?
Yeah, well, I think the way to think about the Paschal mystery and the crucifixion, and then relatedly this, is that, you know, these things happen which are problematic as part of God's permissive will, right? But, and full stop, they can be terrible, right? Obviously, the crucifixion, suffering, tragedy, trauma is terrible. But and it can lead to despair. But when we invite God into that, he can draw good from it. So I think that has to be the starting point for making sense of this. It's like, what good do you see that God is drawing from our current cultural climate, political situation? I have one.
I'd love to hear it. What do you think?
I just saw an article about how something like 85 to 90% of new seminarians are traditional and conservative. And that eventually some of the problems in the history of our church over the last 50 years are going to be eradicated by a new generation of young priests. So as like the leftist position in our country, which more and more contains a platform that has values that are antithetical to Catholic values. If you're coming up as a young person and you're becoming a priest and you're trying to live your faith, your values are going to align with more traditional values, which are based on family, et cetera, et cetera. So one good thing that God is doing with all this is he's creating a generation of priests that we can trust, as opposed to, I mean, not too long ago, look back a little bit, there's a lot of scandal, there's a lot of problems, there's a lot of priestly preaching and teachings that are in contradiction to the Catholic Church because of like various political ideologies infiltrating the church. So now those things are kind of lined up. So I think that's a good thing.
It's a great thing. We can see history with this pendulum swing, and going back to Monsignor Shea's Apostolic Time or Christendom to Apostolic Times, he talks about this, like, where it's one or the other, and one's going to lead to the other. So if you're in apostolic times when the government, the support, the structure, the society, the cultural milieu does not have a sort of Christocentric value system built into it implicitly.
Yes.
We're out there and what we're saying is crazy. But because it's so crazy, it stands out, and then more people listen to it, and then slowly people start to listen, people are converted. And then next thing you know, which is maybe it's like 700 years, but like the next phase is now we're in Christendom. Like here's the whole, like everything in culture now is permeated by these Christian values. Then what happens? Then people take it for granted. Then there's duplicity because you start to, it's like, okay, yeah, we all do the rituals and ceremonies, but like interiorly, we're not being challenged for real conversion. So now it starts to slip. And now all these other things come in, and now there's enlightenment, and then there's the industrial revolution, and then there's Marxism and communism, and people are like, now people have no idea who we are. So now we're swinging back into apostolic times.
Yep.
And, there's only hope here. Like it's always a beautiful
Only
thing.
one way to go.
There's only one way to go. So now it's like, now you get people that were like fully embedded within a non-Christocentric mindset, like Russell Brand, and it's like, oh, wait a minute. Now this guy who is like so relativistic,
he's so funny to me,
so spiritualist or whatever, but it's like all BS. But actually, it's still human. It's coming out of a human heart. And then all of a sudden he's like being attracted towards real prayer, attracted towards realizing that the God that he finds inside of himself has to be connected to a real God outside of himself.
Yes.
And then it's like, oh, that's profound. Like,
yes,
that idea sticks out like a sore thumb because it's not accepted generally and taken for granted.
Yes. And this is a hopeful perspective. And I think it applies to many, many people, but unfortunately it doesn't apply to everyone. The next topic I want to talk about is what is called boy sobriety.
Okay.
Believe me, I'm going to connect these. So single women have hopped on a new trend of abstaining from romantic or sexual relationships with men, including dating and casual hookups. Therapists, I don't know who these therapists are. They don't work with us. Therapists say the emergence of the boy sober movement is indicative of a greater trend among young women taking a step back from sex relationships and puts a new spin on voluntary celibacy. So I'll go into more of this article. But the idea is women are realizing that being obsessed with romance without any kind of transcendent value and having casual sex and hookups doesn't work. And this is, how I want to connect it is that, the church is always right. Like it's just always right. So the moral teachings of the church have psychological import. And what we discover is that sooner or later, the damage that is done by living outside of church teaching catches up with the rest of society. And sometimes, like in the case of Russell Brand, he's like, wait a minute, the life that I was living was not making me happy. Let me look at Christianity, for example. But then sometimes people like take it and still kind of like try and double down on their secular worldview and find a way to twist it, right? So something like divorce, for example, like the church is like, divorce isn't so good. And everyone's like, divorce is fine. And now it turns out like, instead of being like, oh, the church was right, people are like, I just won't get married. Like maybe I just want my own individual freedom instead of getting married. So here's another one. Contraception is another one. The church was right. It's just like, it's destroying women's bodies, literally destroying their bodies from within. Right. So they're just trying to find new ways to be creative with birth control. Right. And this is another one here. Women for all the wrong reasons are not engaging in romantic relationships in a healthy way. I
am gonna push back on you in a way that is like ironic to our normal dynamic here. But why are you saying for all the wrong reasons?
Here's an example.
Why are you taking this cultural trend and looking at it through such a negative light?
Let me tell you.
Okay.
So there's this therapist, last name Pickle, Francis Pickle, something like that. Pickle, not Pickles. Changing what it feels like to be single, women are redefining what it means to be single. Being single is not something shameful. It doesn't signal any kind of lack, but it is an empowered choice. By being boy sober, women are actively decentering men in their lives, and rather than trying to please men, taking a step back. Through this intentional break, some of Piquel's clients have even realized they were queer and were able to begin exploring their sexuality. You can get so caught up in the game of compulsive heterosexuality that you don't even necessarily realize or entertain the idea of dating people other than men, she says. That's why I'm highlighting this. Because this is
It
not
says boy
this is not
sobriety
virtue. This is
lieu
not virtue
of.
and purity. This is not virtue and purity. This is let's take the power that men have and the desire for romance.
But wait, back up a second. Is this Pickle's perspective, or is this actually what everybody means by boy sobriety? Is this
Piquel.
because he's Pickle in my book? But if Pickle's perspective, Pickle picked a peck of Pickle's perspectives, then how, like, is this actually what is meant by this trend?
Yes. So what makes it different from voluntary celibacy? For Johnson, there's just all these names all over this article, but all these therapists that are experts that they're citing. Going boy sober was a fun spin on celibacy, as it entails all the same things as celibacy, but just in an exciting way. Francis says the language we use actually goes way deeper than celibacy, and reflects a communal aspect that makes boy sobriety appealing to young women. While celibacy centers on abstinence and purity, sober is about clear-headedness. This language is a lot about reclaiming that energy for yourself. You still get to be a sexual or sensual being, even if you're no longer pursued or trying to get the attention of partners. Boy sober also means moving away from the historical context of celibacy. Francis says it's often about purity, external forces, and proving or earning something.
I'm sorry. Everything you're reading, no matter what part of you is reading it in a very slanted and biased way, I can still hear in the actual words being read a resounding clarity call from a desire for how God has actually created us. And if you actually read that, if like most of what you just read could have been written by John Paul II, actually giving direction to priests, like what we mean historically by celibacy, I would say in the church is pretty bad. And do we need to go deeper than that? Yes. And should we look at how it's not just about what you're giving up? It's actually about a deeper understanding of your sexuality. Yes. John Paul II would be saying, yes, that's exactly right. Celibacy doesn't mean you don't have sexuality anymore. And if our priests could understand that, and our celibate religious could understand that, like, that would heal a lot of problems. And so maybe
Absolutely.
it's not perfect. I'm not saying that they're doing it. They don't know that they're even doing it correctly. But if it was like, I just wanted to know if it meant specifically you're being sober from boys because you can pursue sexual relationships with other females.
That's part of it.
What they? But is that the definition of what this whole trend means?
No, young women.
Or is it just I'm taking time for myself? I'm going to reclaim some clarity in my mind. I'm going to get to know myself for who I really am. I'm going to move away from codependency to a position of independence, which is a necessary step towards healthy interdependence later. And I would say, praise God.
Yeah, no, it's good in a certain sense. I'm just saying it's not the actual ideal. It's a altered version of what the church teaches in the first place. And so in some ways it's like, it's highlighting that a lot of young women objectify men in the like ideal. It's like imagined ideal of my happiness coming through marriage as an end, right? It's like in the same. There's this movie with, I think was it Shia LaBeouf? No, I forget who it was, but it was a movie about pornography with Scarlett Johansson, and there was this like argument between Scarlett Johansson and it's the guy that played Robin in Batman. I can't remember his name. But he was the argument was like she found out that he had a pornography addiction, and she was really, really angry with him about it because he was objectifying women. He was like, he was creating unreal expectations for for her that he was projecting onto her. And his rebuttal to her was like, "You're doing the same thing to me. Like, I see
Yeah.
your pupils dilate when you're watching romantic comedies with these imagined
Yes.
ideas of who a man is." The article says, like, young women love fantasizing and daydreaming about the maybes and possibilities, and often find that actually talking to the person ruins it. They love coming back and talking about their experiences with their friends, but the actual interactions that they're having with men and with romantic and sexual feelings are often disappointing, confusing, overwhelming, and they find themselves in unsafe contexts. So it's like the idea of what relationships are is what's problematic, and to obsess over that
Right.
is psychologically problematic, right? It's unhealthy. And so this is a movement to say, like, hold on, let's take a step back.
Yeah,
So
that
that
movie
part
Don
is good.
John. Griffin said Don John. It was an awesome movie. It was so good.
Yeah.
In fact, I had written a blog before it, and then I brought it back out on emotional pornography, and I
Right.
was talking about like these rom-coms and these novels and these books and the fantasies that are in on the emotional level. And that's exactly my point. So it's like, all right, is this there's some deeply natural human reaction to all the failures of the sexual revolution. And back to your point before, it's like the church has been saying this the whole time. And
Yes.
it's like we are all sitting around waiting for this to happen. We know this is going to happen over and over and over again. Over the centuries, this is always going to happen. Culture has no idea what it's like, oh, this new thing called boy sobriety, like this new thing of natural fertility. This, oh, now there's an app for tracking your fertility cycle. And it's because it's like holistic and green and all this stuff. It's like,
Yeah.
we've been saying this forever. You guys thought we were crazy for saying it.
Yeah.
And maybe the way we were saying it needed to be improved a bit. Like that's the whole point of theology of the body. But theology of the
Yes.
body is the same thing. It's like same church teachings that have always been there,
Yes.
but now revised and updated to be able to communicate with culture where they are today.
Yeah, I think what I'm dismayed by with this article is finally the culture agrees with the church on what is problematic. But where we diverge is the solution. Because what I'm reading in this article is the answer is female empowerment, not healthy vision of community
Yeah,
between
like
men
I
and
said,
women.
if I don't know if it's a trending thing and you got a bunch of people on TikTok or whatever and they're hashtagging it, then
Yes.
that's different from Professor Pickle, who's like
Cal.
telling us about like his perspective. Anything that's a trend, anything that's cultural is going to be ridiculously distorted by a secular therapist, secular psychology. So,
Mhm.
like, I'm not going to look at the secular psychology perspective on a cultural trend to define what that cultural trend is really about. Of
That's
course,
fair.
they're going to say it that way.
Yes.
But, like, Trixie Dust 4202, underscore
Maybe
summer
Trixie,
fun
maybe she's
at
finding God.
maybe that's what she's like. I'm done with boys for the summer. Like, I need to find myself. I need to rediscover who I am. Like, hashtag boy sobriety. Like, sweet.
Listen, you should take vacations more often. I love this positive spin you're taking on things.
I don't know how I'm the one doing this right now. Usually it's the other way around, but you're like, oh, the culture
No,
is so
no,
bad.
it's because, like, I have this hope that, like, things will bear out. Like, when people have espoused these values that are inconsistent with the Catholic view, like, things will play out. It's like there's a part of me that's like, I told you so. Like, you're pushing back against the church or criticizing the church,
I
but
get
they
it.
were
I
right. But
usually
the
have
church
that
was right,
part.
and then, like, we get to this point where it's like they're like, oh yeah, the church was right, but the church still doesn't have the answer. Christ isn't the
They're
answer.
not connecting it. They're not integrating it. They're not actually
No.
getting the deeper sense of it. But I think it's really important for people in ministry and priests, especially, to be
Yes.
paying attention. So that, I mean, every priest could be preaching from the pulpit this Sunday, be like, hey, hashtag boy sobriety. Like, let's talk about what that is. Like, this is what's going on. This is how we can direct our hearts. This is how we
Sure.
can integrate with what we already know to be true from a Catholic perspective. See, the world's ways doesn't work, and they're figuring it out. We have the whole answer, and everybody that's thinking about it and has been burned by the world's ways, pay attention.
Are you suggesting that priests get on TikTok?
That's another story entirely.
How are they going to learn about these
I'm
cultural
sure
trends?
there's some TikTok priests that haven't given it up yet. But I do think too, like it's a kind of trend that it's just a repeat and recycle story. I mean, when I met my wife, she was away from the church, and when we were dating, I had given her Theology of the Body for Beginners to read,
Yeah.
and when she read that, she was like, "I got to tell all my friends about this. How do they not know? Like, how come nobody talks about this?" She's like, "This is
Barbara is
why
a
their hearts
leader.
are broken all the time."
She is a leader.
But then she's like, and then she gets like cynical about it. Her friends are like, "Oh, my heart's broken." She's like, "I don't want to hear about your heart being broken again. Like you slept with the guy after two dates. Like, of course your heart's broken. Think about what
Right.
you just did."
Right.
She's like, "How about don't do that anymore if you don't want your heart to be broken?"
Yep. Yep.
Is my audio okay? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Loud and clear. You're speaking right to
Okay.
my heart.
Okay.
You're moving my
Through
heart.
your eardrum.
It's inspiring me. Yes. Go on.
No, I just think so. It's like, okay, same story. And that was like, that was like 12 years ago or whatever. It's like, but that's the same story that's been every year. So like, okay, the culture is like, oh, we shouldn't be doing this anymore with our boyfriends and girlfriends. And oh, chivalry is dead. We should bring it back. It's like, oh, really? No kidding.
Right. Right. So stay close to the church. That's the message, everyone.
Let's
Stay
just go
close
from
to-
like boy sobriety to chastity.
Well, engage with the culture. Listen to what the culture is telling you and try and connect that with what we believe to be true from a Catholic perspective.
You know what we could do? Let's go with the flow with it. Let's say like, you know what? We got to do something new, church. How about let's call it Chastity 2.0. And it's not going to be any different than Chastity 1.0, but we're going to just talk about it differently.
We should start the girl sobriety movie. The other thing that comes to my mind here is like the power of words. I remember in my mid-20s when I came to realize that when I was talking about females that I was dating, that when I talked to them, when I called them a girl, that came with it all sorts of feelings and perspectives and thoughts. It was like, I was dating this girl. And then I realized, like, I don't want to date a girl. I want to date a woman. And if like I'm picturing someone, a female, in the sense that they are a girl, like they're never going to give me what I need, right? There's going to be an immaturity that's associated with that person. But then it's like, okay, I only want to date a woman. If I experience someone as a girl, then that's not the person for me. So that really opened me up to like finding my wife when I was looking for a woman. Also, it made me realize, oh, I'm kind of a boy. A woman doesn't want to date a boy. I need to become a man, right?
Yeah.
So like the whole premise of the movement is like we're abstaining from boys. Good. You shouldn't be dating boys. You should be dating men. And you should become.
Yeah, there's so exactly, and it's great. It works both ways, and that's when you use like movies and novels and imagery like from different characters. It's like who's the new ideal, and you move away from like a pornified culture with like magazine cover ideals to like who's the kind of woman, and it's crazy when you start to think about that difference, and then what should really be the goal for dating and the goal for all these different things that are, and it's a totally different world. And you find out like, oh yeah, there are people out there. They're not the same people you thought you were looking for.
Right.
But when you know what the values are and virtues are that you want to actually like commit your life to for the rest of your life till death do you part. It changes everything.
It does. And you know what's so interesting too is that you can be blind to what is good for you in the dating world. And you ever work with a client who says something like, I keep dating the same, like they have a view of the opposite sex where I keep dating the same type of person over and over and over again. And therefore all men are scum. Like you've heard that all men are jerks. You can't trust any men. And then you ask them like, well, have you ever had a nice man pursue you? Like, well, yeah. Well, what happened? Well, I wasn't really interested in them.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's like you get tunnel vision. Like this goes all the way back to like your family history and what you're looking like. You're dating boys over and over again that are immature and unhealthy, and that's the only thing you're seeing because you're not open to probably really healthy men that could give you what you're longing for at the deepest level.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. And it takes time to get there.
It does. Because you got to work on yourself too. Now, I'm going to try and segue this. It's going to be tough. The next topic I want to talk about is actually adoption. So maybe we shift from like dating to fruitfulness, right?
Okay.
When two people love each other, the love cannot be contained between a husband and a wife. It's too big for that. God cannot be contained between two people. And it spirates. It's very Trinitarian, right? Like spirates into fruitfulness and potentially a third person. So I found this article on adoption, which I thought was very, very interesting. It talks about like the psychological perspective on the challenges of adoption that people don't often think about. Here are some of the main points of this article. It says adoption has an impact on your identity. It can create a profound sense of unstable identity for adoptees who often struggle with questions of self and belonging. Another point is family dynamics. The adoptive family structure is complex, can lead to feelings of alienation and anxiety for the adopted child. Cultural perceptions. Society often imposes pressure on the person who's adopted to feel grateful, which can overshadow the inherent challenges that they face. And then there's some legal and social challenges as well. But I thought this was really interesting. I don't think enough attention is given to what the experience of being adopted is like, the psychological challenges from a parental perspective and from the perspective of the child who's adopted. Do you have any kind of like preliminary thoughts on some of these principles before we go into it a little deeper?
I mean, I don't know about the preliminary principles, but I do have some pretty deep perspective on this in terms of like what I think the world has it backwards.
Yes.
And I think I was just talking to my dad about this, and he was telling me about this priest at his church on their Father's Day. You know, the priest is telling everybody Happy Father's Day, and then he says, I'd like to hear Happy Father's Day from you too. If you feel like you want to say Happy Father's Day to me on your way out, like I love hearing that. Because he's like, I'm a father.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, it's actually not even like that's not the afterthought. It's like the fact is that biological fatherhood is a sign of spiritual fatherhood.
Yes.
So
which is
it's
primary.
One
fatherhood
is bigger than the other. The
Yeah.
spiritual fatherhood is the real fatherhood.
Yes.
Of which God has built into the world signs of that point us to the realities of spiritual fatherhood. So the fact of the matter is like whatever we can see physically manifest in biological fatherhood is pointing us to a higher, deeper, bigger reality, which is transcendent. And then the best and fullest and perfect example of this is Christ himself. So if we see that, and this is the church, that Jesus Christ reveals man to himself and makes his divine calling clear. What does Jesus reveal to us about being a son in a family? He was an adopted son in a family.
Yes.
So he's revealing a fundamental identity of our humanity is that we are primarily adopted.
Yes. We are orphans.
We're orphans
who are adopted.
This is the fundamental, primary, most important, most true part of our identity and reality.
Yes.
And some of us happen to be in biological families, and then that reality is a sign of what it's like to be adopted spiritually.
Yes.
And this is one thing that John Paul II wrote about St. Joseph. And he said that in Guardian of the Redeemer about St. Joseph, he says that Joseph's vocation was to provide an example of fatherhood in which a biological reality could not confuse who the true father is.
It's beautiful. It's wonderful.
That's not a direct quote, but that's a summary of the passage from Guardian of the Redeemer. So it's like, if the world is like, adoption creates all these identity issues, it's like, that's because you got it backwards. You think biological childhood is like the primary fundamental kind of childhood and parent-child dynamic. And therefore adoption is like, we got to now like make this make sense. Like, how are you still my child? How are you still my dad? Like, no, it's the other way around.
Yes, I think that is all true in the abstract. I don't know that it's just like as simple as saying, no, the world has it wrong. Like maybe at the highest cultural level it does, or the highest philosophical level it does. But I think it is important to give, like, offer some sensitivity to the natural order and the natural experience of, say, being
Yes, but
adopted into a family.
the natural order is just a sign.
Yes.
So it's like, oh, I'm on my way to visit the beach, and then there's this big billboard, and it has a photograph of the beach on it, and it says, the
Yes.
beach is, 50 miles that way, and then you like go up to the billboard, and you're like hitting the billboard, and you're touching it, and you're like, this is the most disappointing experience of a beach that I've ever had. Like,
Right.
okay, that's understandable,
Yes.
but it's also kind of limited. It's like you're hitting the limit. You're limiting yourself to what you think the beach is supposed to be because you're
Yes.
sticking with the sign instead of going to the reality.
Yes. I guess maybe I would frame it this way. There is a higher risk of and therefore a need to really emphasize these spiritual truths that you were talking about in cases of adoption, whereby people often have fragmented senses of self and struggle with questions of identity and can feel alienated. So, like, all the more reason to really emphasize stuff that we would emphasize to our biological children, that you are built for communion with God the Father, and I am participating in the
Exactly.
Father's love for you. So, like, I guess the point of the article, like, if we situate it properly, is that there's just a higher risk of problematic ways of thinking about family life in the case of an adoption. All the more reason for
If
us.
you don't have a Christocentric worldview,
Exactly. Exactly
which
right.
is
Yeah.
just another example of like when you don't have a Christocentric worldview, this world does not actually satisfy, nor does it actually make sense.
Yes. Yes.
Because here we go, like not even just adoption, but then actually in family, like in biological families, it's like, show me the perfect biological family. Like
No,
there's
right.
not one. So then every instance of family is going to hit a wall, and every instance is going to end up with people unsatisfied.
Yes.
So
It's true.
if you don't have a Christocentric worldview, this world is not satisfying. That's like the moral of the story.
It's the moral of the story. I just don't want to lose the complexity of the psychological experience of the adoptee.
How
Like,
are we losing? What do you mean?
well, like,
In a
here's this line here, like,
non-Christocentric worldview.
no, like, even in a Christocentric worldview, there's still like, okay, here's a line here, like, there's a societal pressure on adoptees to feel grateful, which can overshadow the emotional complexities they face. It's like, you should, like, that's a real psychological experience that someone's going to have. Probably it's like there's pressure, like, you got adopted, so feel grateful, but maybe it feels a little weird or confusing that you look different than your parents, than the other kids on the
I guess my
playground
question
who
is,
look
why
who
are
look
we
just
like?
like their parents.
Yes, that happens. That does happen. It also
Yeah,
happens in biological families for different reasons.
sure.
That's a sign of that's a symbol or an example of imperfection because you have a family who's not raising their adopted child within a Christocentric worldview in which they would have all of the dynamics, family dynamics of a family as a school of love understood and communicated and taught through that education that's happening in that school of love.
Yes. I think what I would like to explore from a psychological perspective is the unconscious experience of an infant who came into this existence within a womb of a mother. So they know the mother's smells, they know the mother's sounds, and then at some point they are separated from the first experience of what should be someone who loves them. And the temptation to feel rejected is a psychological thing to overcome, no matter how wonderful an adopted family is. There is a reality to being separated biologically from a parent.
There's so many variables here. Are you talking about a traumatized child who's like neglected and abandoned? Are we talking about trauma?
I mean, that's one scenario. It doesn't even have to be. I think probably in any scenario, an adopted child at being separated from the mother is going to register on some unconscious psychological level that needs to be addressed over the course of their life. I'm postulating that. And it's a unique struggle is what I'm saying. I'm not saying it shouldn't be overcome and it shouldn't be healed, shouldn't be emphasized like this, everything you're saying from a Christocentric perspective, the spirituality, but it is a unique psychological experience.
It's unique. It's unique. And it's one unique of experience of the multitude of unique experiences that people have facing their own identity and their own distress for different reasons. So we're built to be connected to that mother-child connection, that dyad, that, we could talk about attachment and attunement and all those things. But also, like, if you're like taken as an infant and placed in a solid and happy and well-grounded attachment, family, Christocentric grounded system, you're going to have less distress and issues with identity than if you had some separation, some trauma, and then you're in a family that doesn't know how to actually navigate those complexities, doesn't have a higher story to teach and tell.
Yes. Certainly. No, I certainly agree.
So I just think most people are not actually educated in how to even do an adoption. Like Jack asked, like, how do you discern if you should even be ready to adopt a child? I mean, that's a significant question. And then there's like layers of education that can happen. Most parents don't have a clue what they're actually getting themselves into even before having a baby, their own baby.
I know.
So it's like, how many people are taking classes on the family at School of Love and understanding like what the church really teaches and what the family unit is supposed to be, biological or adopted? I think most kids are being born into situations where their families are not set up to do an outstanding job of educating their children.
Totally. I'm often inspired by like the beauty of families where there's like a mix of biological and adopted children. So it's not as if like I've made this decision because I couldn't have children. I actually just see the beauty in adopting a child and bringing a child into my family, into our school of love.
It's true. And I know families, and Barbara and I have discerned it. We still openly discern it. It's like with all the work that we do in Haiti and stuff, we're always like, man, is God calling us to actually give one of these kids a different shot? And, maybe at some point we will, but it's gotta be, the proper, for somebody actually discerning that's assuming a whole bunch of other things that like they're, actually dialed into this Christocentric worldview in a really healthy way. It's like, okay, so there's going to be this overflowing of your marital grace and love, the spiration of marital love that's coming out of the sacrament. And it's going to take various forms. Sometimes, very rarely, it takes the form of a biological child, but it takes many, many forms. And no matter what way that you're germinating and spreading seed, literally, to plant into fertile soil of the society and culture and environment and house around you, like, where do the discernment is, are we being called to nurture these kinds of seeds in these ways?
Yes.
And some of them are outside of your control and discernment providentially when God gives a child to a couple biologically. Like, we're not in control of that process. But then you can decide, like, actively, are we going to bring these extra things into our family? Are we going to share our marital love in these extra ways? Do we have the resources, the bandwidth, the calling? Is God actually inviting us to that greater gift of self in this extra way?
Yeah, and that's a whole. It's like Jack's question is like a really big question. It's a question of how does one discern what God is calling me to do? It gets very specific to my life. How do I discern whether I'm called to adopt? Like, how do you discern if you're called to take this job or have a hot dog for lunch, whatever?
By the way, we have a Catholic psychology. It says on Facebook, somebody that's Catholic psychology PH. But I'm guessing that's a PhD. Maybe it's just PH, like
PH
on the
balance.
PH. But Catholic psychology, if you're with us and you have a comment, you just said hi. So hello right back at you. Don't know if you have a comment or a question. Beth says, Sister Miriam James Heidland has a beautiful testimony. Yeah, she was adopted and she went through her own challenges because of that. Her story is pretty great.
Yeah.
And Hannah says, do you think it matters about the intent of the adopters, which influences how the adoptee feels about themselves? Yes, Hannah, to the point that we're talking about right now. Exactly. So there could be a lot of intents for adoption that are not about this like overflow of our understanding of our marital grace and love.
Right.
And then a child becomes used in some way,
Right.
or just inadvertently, and it could be unconscious and not intentional, but it could be an
Yes.
inadvertent using of a child, and that happens in the biological families as well.
Yes. Even just like for emotional reasons, like I will feel incomplete if I do not like have a child or something. So this child is designed to fulfill my emotional needs rather than me actually giving of myself to the child. The
So
child is
many
here to
ways.
serve me emotionally.
You're grieving infertility, and it's like, this is going to make me feel better, or you're grieving the loss of a child,
Yeah.
the death of a
Which, not
child.
to
This is
minimize,
going
those
to
are
make
very
me feel
painful
better.
experience. Not to
Yeah, of
minimize, those are very
course.
painful experiences. Very painful.
And those are things to grieve. Like, those are actually things to grieve. But the point is, if you are using a child for yourself to feel better, if that's your primary intention, not to say that it can't be a double effect,
Right.
which is a principle we've talked about here before. It's like, if you intend to be a gift of self, and in the process, it also happens to be the fact that you're getting something back in
And
return,
you feel right.
praise
Well,
God. Like, that's not a bad thing.
if we didn't have that, no one would ever have kids.
Well,
they're pretty terrible human beings. Let's face it. They yell a lot. They poop themselves. They're expensive. So like their greatest defense is how adorable they are and the joy that they bring us.
I often hear Barbara saying that if it's just her and the baby, not in earshot of the other kids who would make sense of it, but sometimes I see her cuddling the baby. It's like, it's so good, you're so cute.
Yes. Hear multiple tones. It's so
Yeah.
good that you're adorable at 4 a.m. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh man, yeah, that's really good. But there's a lot to that. But I think what the theme is, the point is, we all need a Christocentric worldview, and we got to do our part. We are in apostolic times now, and the world doesn't have it. And so the more we can promote a Catholic beauty and truth and goodness to the realities of life that give answer to why this world is not satisfying, we can then make sense of everything that's going on in this world, like that fabric that we can see the underside of. We know there's another side of it.
Yeah.
And it'll make sense of all of this.
Yeah. And just I think we should probably start wrapping up here, but the close on St. Joseph, I think, is so important. Like the fact that there is adoption in the Holy Family as a model for us. It's like, it's good enough for St. Joseph. It's good enough for me.
It's good enough for Jesus. It's like, okay, so if God, the creator of the universe, the beginning and the end, who made time itself and the space of the world itself, and then decided, I'm going to enter into space and time.
Yeah.
The most perfect of perfect, the infinite perfection.
Right.
Had any infinite choices of how to enter into the world he created. His choice was to come into the world as an adopted son.
Yeah.
What?
I know. And he's out there washing feet, like he totally flips things on its head. Yeah.
It's like, no, actually being a biological son would not have been the most perfect way to come into the world. Being an adopted son was the most perfect way to come into this world.
Yes.
Wow.
I got no pushback for that. It's profound.
Sit with that one.
It's profound.
Let us all be more adopted today.
Yes. We have some questions here right at the end. We really don't have time to answer them, but what you could do is email us at mailbag@catholicpsych.com. Monday, we'll be doing a Monday mailbag session. We might do it every Monday if we get enough questions, but this Monday, we're certainly going to do it. So mailbag@catholicpsych.com, put mailbag in the subject heading. And really, I mean, you want to talk to us about psychology, about spirituality, about current events, anything on your mind. We like AI. We like Star Wars. We like Lord of the Rings. No, I'm just kidding. Anything you want to talk about, it's up to you. We're here to serve you. We are serving you. You're not here for our emotional needs.
We're here for you.
Have a good weekend.
God bless you all. Have an awesome weekend.